Hello everyone, I'm Camille here for MLS Digest, here to preview the Week 5 MLS slate coming your way March 22nd and 23rd. And there's two teams off this week, the first week with teams on a bye or what have you, and that's Inter Miami and the Revolution. So 14 games this weekend, despite as well this international break starting. The MLS schedule continues on, but obviously many teams will be without key players, so we're going to have to keep an eye out for that. And I'll get you updated on everything you need to know with injuries, players that are gone for the international break, and how that's going to affect squad rotations. Before I get into everything for Week 5, please make sure to leave a like down below on the video and subscribe if you're new to the channel to help support the content. The first game of the slate is between Cincinnati and Atlanta, two East contenders that have really not lived up to all the hype, at least so far, with Cincy winning both its home games but dropping both of its road games, and Atlanta just one win in 4 games, getting shut out in 2 of those, including letting Miami come from behind and win it late last week. Atlanta's got a massive problem this week due to so many players going on international break that it's only left them with one true center back available and just 2 or 3 other wing backs available on that back line, because Gregerson, Abram Cobb all leaving, and then also in midfield Slish and Fortune and Miguel Almiron on that right-hand side, who's probably been Atlanta's best attacker outside of Latte, who's been putting away the goals. But for an attack that's been, not living up to expectations fully yet, I think Almiron has probably been the best playmaker of the 3, to be feeding and just, running the tempo for Atlanta. But Latte will be remaining. You're probably going to see a front 4 of him, Moranchuk, Sabelo Janiza on the left. And even though Jean De Silva is a left winger, there's no right wing depth now with Almiron leaving, so he's probably going to have to play on the right side, and that midfield's going to be a bit of a problem unless Click finally is available now after a couple weeks with an injury. But that back line, which was already injured to start the season and got some guys back, is once again going to be a little bit thin, and against the Cincinnati attack, who is not really losing too much, it's going to be a problem to kind of try and stop the Cincinnati offense, which has looked good at home. For Cincinnati, the biggest concern is that Denke is gone for international duty, so that probably leaves Corey Barrett or Santos filling in up top alongside most likely Kubo, who's been very, very good for them. Evander's all good to go, and no one else really going for international duty, but that back line does have some problems with Hadebe dealing with green card issues. And Miles Robinson, who suffered an injury last week, it looked bad, but he's available for selection, according to Pat Noonan. And then also Nick Hagland, who got injured last year, I believe he's been out for quite some time now, is finally back after a couple appearances for FC Cincinnati 2. And so he's available for selection as well to possibly make his debut. Maybe not a start, but with the kind of situation they're dealing with right now, maybe could be forced into a start. So some trouble on both back lines, and it's hard to trust either defense against what is still a lot of attacking talent left between both teams. It's difficult to not see this one having a lot of goals in it, with both back lines pretty messy, and I think this one ends in a draw. I think Cincinnati probably the more cohesive group, but I think the change of lineup a little bit with these depth options for Atlanta coming into starting roles now, which I think they would be starting on many other MLS teams, I think that might do them a little bit good, because this front line, this front starting group has been pretty frustrated and not very, the chemistry hasn't been there at the moment. And with Denke out, I'm not really high on either replacement striker alongside Kubo. They haven't really shown too much in their time with Cincy so far. And so I think we see goals in this one, but I'm going to call it tie. I say 2-2. Minnesota hosting the Galaxy in this one after the Loons completely threw away a 3-0 lead on the road at Kansas City in the final half hour, and still a point on the road, but considering the circumstances of how it happened, a deflating result for sure. And for the Galaxy, after 3 weeks to start the season as champs, going without a point, finally picked up its first point on the road against Portland, despite maybe should have gotten a penalty called against them in the final moments. Now, we all know what the Galaxy have been dealing with from an injury perspective to start this season, and all this roster turnover that's led to these poor results and lack of chemistry, and that's still going to continue here as players work their way back. But for Minnesota, it's a complete bloodbath in terms of what they're used to and the players that are leaving for this international break. Dane St. Clair, the starting goalkeeper, 2 starting defenders in Boxall and Harvey, Robin Lod, a fantastic chance creator in the midfield, and then also one of the two two strikers in that two-striker setup, Tani Oluwaseyi leaving, with also Hassani Dotson, who's been, in my opinion, playing out of his mind despite requesting a trade before the season started, still putting in some great shifts. He didn't train earlier this week, but I don't think it's too big of a concern. I think he'll be good to go. But regardless, that's a lot of starting players already leaving, on top of the fact that Rosales, one of those key wingbacks in the system, has been out for some time, could return as well, but still questionable in that sense. And I think a lot of attacking potential remains in what remains of this lineup and the potential, because you still have Yabo, you still have Hlongwane, and you still have Pereira, two of your DPs. And so the attacking potential is there. I just don't think this back line is going to be as solid, especially with how much pressure they like to absorb. But with the Galaxy's issues as well, they still haven't particularly impressed. Even last week in that draw against Portland, that was a very weak Portland team dealing with its own injuries. And I think Minnesota still comes out with the win despite all these issues. I think both teams dealing with these issues. I think Minnesota is still the far more, prepared and cohesive team with the players they have still remaining. And at home, I think they'll still get by the Galaxy, and I'm going to call this a 2-1 win for the Loons. Charlotte hosts the Earthquakes after already starting the season 2-for-2 at home with 2 clean sheets as well, both 2-0 results. Meanwhile, the Earthquakes have lost 2 in a row, both being at home, and now they have a long trip over to the East Coast here with now confirmed Hernan Lopez, after getting a red card suspension, also picked up a shoulder injury that he is out for about 3 to 4 months for, and that's a massive loss for this Earthquakes team in terms of a chance creation, that attacking midfield side of things. And also missing this week Josef Martinez due to his call up to the national team. So that continues to hurt their prospects in this one and just going forward after a very positive first 2 weeks. But for Charlotte as well, missing some key players, Tim Ream for USA going on duty, Liel Abada, and also Ajaming going for international duty. So that leaves really little attacking depth. You still have Zaha, Pep Biel, Vargas, who can probably, maybe one of those two wingers, Zaha or Vargas, could probably play on the opposite wing because of this lack of depth on specifically the right hand side. But regardless, that midfield and defense outside Reeves or Ream is still very elite. They're still playing at home. San Jose has to travel here, and I just don't think San Jose wins this midfield battle. And it's probably going to be another scrappy game in that sense, but that's what Charlotte loves, and I still think the pieces remaining can get the job done, and I just don't see this Earthquakes team really being too threatening in this road environment here. And so I think Charlotte honestly can make another simple work of this game and probably pull out something like another 2-0 result. So that's what I'm going for. I think the Quakes are facing a bit of a reality check after some great wins to start the season, but as the competition improves here, as they've faced in the past 2 weeks now, and especially this matchup with Charlotte, I think they're going to get figured out and exposed in some senses, and I think that continues here, especially with the Lopez news. I think that's a big blow for their prospects this season and of course in this match. So I'm going to go for a 2-0 win for Charlotte. The Crew hosts NYCFC after a series of long road trips to the West Coast, with one of those being against LAFC in Champions Cup, and then last week going to San Diego and maybe being a little fortunate to even get a point out of that after Amundsen picked up a red card early in the second half, and they threw away their 1-0 lead and went to a 1-1 draw. Meanwhile, NYCFC back-to-back wins at home to pick up some great points against Eastern foes. But the Crew host this one, and they're obviously without Amundsen on that red card, and then also some other key losses, Schulte, the starting keeper, and then Arfston and Farsi, some kind of wingers or wingbacks, depending on how you look at it. And 2 key cogs in that machine for Nancy, which, are even bigger losses now considering how little depth they have from an attacking perspective with the players that left and the lack of signings that have been made so far. For NYCFC, it's really just Alonso Martinez missing due to international duty. The rest of the lineup mostly remains the same, but it's not a team I'm very high on in terms of when they have to come up against more elite tested opposition. And we've already seen that, I guess, in a sense against Miami and LAFC, where they've picked up just 1 point from those games. In the Miami game, they choked the lead against 10 men as well. And, they beat 2, an average team, I think, this year in Orlando, and then, a pitiful team in New England where the one goal they gave up was an own goal. But on the flip side, they have played the Crew specifically very tightly the past year and a half for whatever reason. They've just kept things, very compact. The Crew haven't really been able to break them down all that much. And the Crew as well, this back line, it really doesn't matter who's really in there. While they do have their standout players, it just seems like, maybe it's a little bit of recency bias too, but that also has added to this kind of stretch of kind of mistakes, these individual errors, like whether it be a giveaway. I think it was Moreira who gave a giveaway in that Champions Cup first leg against LAFC. And it just seems like one of these defenders always has some sort of massive slip up in games where they probably should be taking home all 3 points, or are still in games, and that's kind of been a bit of why they have maybe struggled in some games. But you're going to see a weaker Crew back line at the same time. But at the same time, I'm just not high on, once again, on this NYCFC, the talent in this team, and with your main scorer in Martinez going out, I think this is another ugly one. The Crew have played a bunch of those already this season after the opening week fireworks, but I still think they get by. I think they'll have enough to get by NYCFC, but I don't think it's going to be a pretty one. I'm calling this one 1-0 to Columbus. Next up, it's the Red Bulls hosting Toronto, and the Red Bulls have had 2 straight draws, including last week at home, a far more open game than usual for Red Bulls home games against Orlando, where it was 2-2. Meanwhile, for Toronto, 3 losses in a row, including another one in their home opener against the Fire after taking the lead early, and a lot of problems for Toronto. They're missing a lot of good, and I say good, but key midfielders at the very least for this international break, with Osorio, Flores, and then also Spicer in the back, and also Bryn Hildson, who picked up an injury in warm-ups ahead of that Fire game, is not going to be ready for this game already officially. And for the Red Bulls, they also have players leaving for the break, with Coronel, the starting keeper, and then also Valencia and Yangar, to name a few. And so it's just too much. I think this is going to be another one of those ugly games. The Red Bulls like to keep things tight anyways. They'll still have their main guys up top with Choupo-Moting and Forsberg. But for Toronto as well, Insigne still probably doubtful in terms of even traveling for this match. And there's just too little cohesion week to week for both of these teams for me to really trust either. And so while the Red Bulls should probably get by here just from the nature of their tempo and their press alone, I just don't have this trust in them at the moment, despite Toronto's problems as well. I just think anything can happen in the way I see this game playing out. I think anything can happen in that sense, and I think Toronto frustrates Red Bulls enough in this one, and this one ends something like a 1-1, but I see a draw in this one. Next up, it's Orlando taking on DC United. Orlando coming off a good draw on the road against the Red Bulls after losing to NYCFC just before. Meanwhile, DC United still undefeated, but a 0-0 draw against Montreal wasn't the most inspiring result based on their attacking performances as well from the past weeks, but they still put up some great numbers and also had a goal disallowed, I believe. But regardless, a great start for the season for DC. But the main theme for both these teams' games, for the most part, so far this season has been goals. And Orlando still allowing 2 goals in every game despite their own attacking successes. DC United, even in their 3 of their 4 results so far, it's been back and forth games. And that's where I'm kind of headed for this first best bet. I'm going with the over 3, the flat 3 in this one. So we get that push protection at -105. And I really like the prospects in this one. Both these teams are 5th and 6th in terms of their numbers, expected goals so far throughout 4 games. And Orlando is bottom, literally bottom, worst so far in terms of how much they're giving up in expected goals allowed so far. And the things get even worse for Orlando with Brekalo out on international duty. He's not a in and out starter, but still he's kind of has been in there even with Janssen back. It's going to be Janssen and Schlegel, but both their wingback situation as well hasn't been very promising from a defensive standpoint. And even though Gillespie has also had his blunders already this season, he's also out for the international break. So you're having a backup keeper coming in as well, and a midfield that is really centered around, the attacking side of the game and going forward, rather than kind of, covering good areas and actually getting back from a defensive perspective. And the fact that they're back at home, both their home games already have been absolute bangers. Meanwhile, DC United missing one of their key center backs already for the international break, Rales for Australia, and then also Matti Peltola going to Finland duty for the break, one of their midfielders. And also Aaron Herrera was supposed to be going on duty, but he has been dealing with an injury, which could maybe, be looked at as a bad thing from DC United's attacking, perspective, because he is one of those main providers of crosses for Benteke, because they do love to cross a lot. But at the same time, I think the other players around Benteke, like Pirani, like Kajima, have already contributed a lot of good things so far this season. And just DC in general, that defense doesn't really hold up. And Orlando being at home, their attack is basically going to be full strength here. The only worry for me is with Pasalic, the newcomer who's gotten off to a flying start, scored again last week. He kind of went off towards the end of the game, limping a little bit, but he played basically almost a full 90. And I'm not really convinced that it's too big of a problem. Also for Orlando, Araujo in midfield might miss a second straight game after missing last week due to some lower body tightness. And it's not a long-term thing, but they have been, cautious with it. So since it is still, soon, and if it's still maybe a problem for him, could miss that. And that would also be another big loss in terms of the defensive side of that midfield, because Araujo specifically has been kind of filling in for Cartagena in terms of the amount of ground that has to be covered from a defensive mid perspective. Had Cartagena been healthy, this midfield would be a little bit more balanced. But right now, with the addition of Atuesta as well, it's just been all attack oriented, and they've been shipping goals and scoring goals at the same time. But specifically at home, they've had a much better go of it in terms of their attacking potential. And just as well, this DC United defense, which is already suspect going on the road, is usually good to give up a couple goals anyways. I see Orlando probably carrying the weight of this. They could definitely get the 3 themselves, but at the same time, with Orlando's the players they're missing due to the break, Gillespie especially, I just think there are going to be big chances throughout this game, back and forth. And that's why we're going with the over 3 with the push protection. And that's where I'm going with for my first best bet. Kansas City goes up against LAFC after a massive comeback for its first point of the season against Minnesota. Meanwhile, LAFC, despite advancing to the Champions Cup quarterfinals, back-to-back losses in MLS play last week against Austin after conceding very early on a corner, and then just offered nothing against that prepared low block from Austin. And in this game, LAFC going to be missing some key players due to the break. Bouanga, of course, but also Ordaz, a key kind of depth option that's been kind of filling in on the right-hand side alongside Martinez, the younger kid. But Under finally got his first start last time out against Austin. There were some good flashes there. It was just a very complicated setup in general for the entire team to break from from an attacking perspective for them against Austin's set defense. But with Bouanga out and Giroud actually also out because he missed last game due to some sort of injury, and now he's going to get honored by the French national team, so he's missing this game against KC. Abobasi starting up top, and then you have David Martinez really and Under as your only real wingers, besides Yeboah as well as an option. And so we're going to see who kind of goes where, who's kind of maybe a little bit more comfortable on the left-hand side, because especially that left-hand depth is going to be tested a little bit. And for Casey, it's really only Basong out for international duty. And so not too big of a problem, considering just the state of that starting 11 in general isn't really anything, amazing or worth being called up, to keep it honest. But clearly KC is on a bit of a high right now after that comeback. It's been definitely a very emotional start for them, considering the losses they've suffered. Going down 3-0 against Minnesota and getting that first point of the season is a great potential to turn things around on this week-to-week basis. But it's an interesting game for me in terms of I really want to see how LAFC approaches this, how Steve Cherundolo approaches this game with this different lineup that he's going to have to field. And I'm actually very positive about the potential that this front three with Abobasi, Under, and probably Martinez or Yeboah could bring. I think it's going to be a bit of a different look. I think this Kansas City midfield is, okay enough for LAFC to kind of deal with, even though a lot of the kind of attacking creative load has been on Mark Delgado. But I think it's the opportunity for some other players to shine, maybe get a little bit more comfortable possession despite being on the road. And I think LAFC might sneak out a win in this one. KC obviously gets to stay home on a bit of a high in that, emotional sense, but I think this might actually be good for LAFC to kind of tinker with things, see what these players are made of in a sense, and see how they might fare without Bouanga. I feel like it's just been too cut and dry, a little bit too predictable with how they've been going about the season to start so far. Obviously also prioritizing Champions Cup with the energy levels, but I'm going to go towards the side of LAFC will look pretty good in this one. I'm just very interested in what these players might have to offer, and I'm going to say LAFC gets this one done 2-1. Nashville hosts Montreal after another fantastic win to turn around the start of this season against the Union, making Philadelphia's perfect run to start the season end. And it's now back-to-back wins for Nashville, coming back at home against Montreal, which this is its fifth straight away game to start the season. Just an absolutely terrible situation to be in. But they did pick up their first point of the season in that 0-0 draw against DC. But just so much to ask out of this Montreal side from an energy, perspective to really be up for so many, tough road games in a row. And it's already taken a toll on them. And it's also, anyways, a very young team that really hasn't contributed from an attacking perspective at the same time, getting shut out in all the last 3 games after that, banger match against Atlanta to start the season. And really, the only players for Nashville that will be missing are Nehar and Schaffelberg, who's also been kind of dealing with injuries to start the season anyway, so he hasn't really been a big part of their plans, at least to start the season, even though he is a fantastic player. But Montreal going to be missing Waterman, one of their center backs. And they also have many players who have been dealing with their own injuries and kind of working their way back to fitness, who would normally be first-team starters. Jalen Neal, who was signed from the Galaxy, Piet, and then also Vrioni, their new DP from the Revs, hasn't even featured so far this season. So it's been an array of issues for Montreal so far. They haven't been full strength. They've been on the road for so long. And maybe we're not seeing, the full potential of this team, but I still don't think it's, really too threatening of a team at its peak powers. And Nashville is in great form, and really only missing one starter that's been playing so far this season due to the break. So Nashville are pretty heavy favorites in this one for a reason. And, I'm going to give them, of course, the edge here, but I'm not going to really, put my money on this Nashville team just yet, despite some good performances. I still want to see more. The midfield has looked, there's been a spark in that midfield with those new players as well. And they should handle business here. I'm not saying that, they shouldn't be favored or anything, but I think, I don't think they're going to be an elite team, just after a couple wins. It's just this is another great opponent to continue building their confidence against, and they're really not, being affected by this international break in really almost any way. And so I think Nashville gets a third straight win. I'm going to go for a 3-1 Nashville win. Next up, the Union hosts St. Louis after finally dropping its first points of the season against Nashville in a 3-1 loss at home last week. Meanwhile, St. Louis, a win against Seattle last week and another shutout and they remain unbeaten with 2 wins and 2 draws, even though Roman Berkey suffered an injury ahead of that Seattle match and is going to be out for a little bit of time, I think about a month or so, with, I believe, a hand injury or something like that, which is obviously extremely important as a goalkeeper. And where I'm going with my second best bet, it's going to be a 2-legger. This is going to be the first leg of it. I'm taking St. Louis on the double chance, so St. Louis to win or draw the match. And honestly, depending on what your juice tolerance is for a bet line, this could be played almost alone, depending on where you get it. But I think this is a great, parlay leg. St. Louis, like I said, still hasn't allowed a goal. Even the backup against Seattle held a clean sheet of his own. And this team really not even getting affected by the international break. And on the flip side, the Union are getting ravaged by it. Yes, they've had a fantastic start to the season, but they're coming off that loss, and they're losing, honestly, 5 or 6 or so of the best players of that starting 11. Andre Blake, one of the best goalkeepers in MLS, still on international duty. Jean-Jacques Hesder, signing from last season, the defensive midfielder, also leaving for duty. Bueno leaving, who's been not really featuring too much, but still a depth option. But then you also have the 2 of the main attacking trio of this team that has lit up the league at the start of the season in Gazdag and obviously Ty Baribo, both also going on international duty. So that's honestly, like, I don't even have the math on me right now, but that's like 80% of their goals so far this season between, those, especially those 2 players. So while you still will have Ura and Quinn Sullivan and the new signing Lukic in the mix, it's just a lot to deal with from last week to now already this week, all that turnover. And it's also a reunion for Bradley Carnell, the Union coach who first coached St. Louis City when they came into the league. So that's another interesting kind of storyline in this game. So it's going to be certainly a fun one because he's still probably going to bring that attacking identity despite all these players missing for the Union. But St. Louis has been rock solid. Everyone from an attacking perspective especially has been healthy. The defense obviously has been really, really good to start the season. And the coach, Melberg, has been kind of preaching to the choir in terms of saying how they still want to improve in terms of their possession levels and percentages. And regardless of maybe not playing the brand of football completely that they want so far, they've still been absolutely flying to start the season with already 8 points. And so I think St. Louis, despite going on the road in this one, Nashville kind of already exposed some of Union's flaws from last game. And I think St. Louis has the players especially to kind of continue that role and at least get a draw out of this one. So I think they probably outright win even. But for this first leg of the best bet, I'm going with St. Louis to win or tie on the double chance. Moving on to the Whitecaps hosting the Fire. And this is one of the last games on Saturday, but I'm moving it up in terms of the order of this video because it is the second leg of my second best bet. The other leg being that Union St. Louis game just before this. And I'm going with the under 3.5 in this one, which brings us to plus 146 total, at least what I got it at. And it should be, not too far off depending on what book you use or whatever. But I think that's a very good price combining these 2 legs. And I'm going with that because the Whitecaps are perfect to start the season. 4 wins from 4, but they've also been dealing with so much schedule congestion, advancing again in Champions Cup. And they're going to be a little bit tight from that anyways, but at the same time, they're losing a bunch of key players to the international break that kind of will ruin, I think, their tempo and just the attacking, that killer instinct that they've had in attack so far this season. They're losing Brian White, their striker. They're losing other key midfielders in Ahmed, Kubas, and Vite. Vite especially has been kind of a player revived or getting the full potential finally out of him under Sorensen. And also Ryan Gauld, who missed the last game especially and is dealing with, I think, a knee injury or something like that. And he's out for a month anyways. So you're missing a lot of key players in this attack, but really no one in that back line or the keeper is out for the Whitecaps. And so they're still going to be probably dominating the game from a possession perspective. But really not going to have that quality to kind of, continue and keep up that, putting goals in the back of the net essentially. And essentially against the Fire as well, who don't really keep too much possession and are now also dealing with some players leaving for international duty, mainly being Brian Gutierrez, who is their main chance creator at the number 10. It's going to be a problem for this Fire team again, another week with some either injury issues or one of their main guys being out again. And while their games have been goal fest so far, this is going to be their third road game in a row. And they've already traveled to Dallas, Toronto, now the Whitecaps. So they're certainly going to have some tired legs on this artificial turf where they're not very. I mean, I guess they do play at Soldier Field, but regardless, it's also just too many midfield injuries for the Fire, and I think they're still going to be under it in terms of how much of the ball Vancouver's going to be having, and they might get peppered with some opportunities, but it's not going to be the same, that same kind of quality and that same kind of finishing aspect from the Whitecaps. And I just don't see the Fire kind of breaking out of that shell and kind of getting out on the break too often. And regardless, the Whitecaps back line remains the same despite some absences in midfield and attack. And so I think the 3.5, we're kind of juicing it up a total goal to make it 3.5, but that's why we're doing 2 legs on this. I think we have a lot of room for error here with these 2 legs combined, and I just don't see this one being a high-scoring game. I think this goes against the trend, despite what the numbers from the Fire have been showing. But with so many players missing from the Whitecaps, it's just hard to see this, consistency maintaining. And it's really only 1 week. It doesn't mean the Whitecaps are frauds or anything like that. Just if they don't look completely dominant this week, it's just hard to expect that with so much player turnover. And I still think they probably do get this one done, just barely, but it's probably going to be a scrappy one. And I say 1 or 2-0 to the Whitecaps. Moving on to a West Coast battle between the Rapids and the Timbers. The Rapids are still unbeaten this season. Now back-to-back road wins to kind of turn things around after exiting Champions Cup and a bit of a sloggy start from, being a little bit tired to start the season. Meanwhile, the Timbers drew against the Galaxy at home last week. Were kind of hard done by a harsh call, like I mentioned at the end there, that could have, won them a game with the penalty, but didn't get it. And I think the Rapids will be all over the Timbers in this one, personally, and I'm going with, for my third best bet, I'm going with the Rapids to win on the money line and over 1.5 goals in this one for plus 115 odds. And really, the Rapids aren't affected by the international break, besides what admittedly is a key loss in Zach Steffen, their main goalkeeper. He's been probably, honestly, the goalkeeper of the season so far. He's really made some amazing saves, kept them in games, and kind of been half the reason, at least, that they won both of those road games recently. And for the Timbers, still dealing with injuries from the start of the season, with Jonathan Rodriguez still not back, and also missing other players due to the break, with Crepeau, who's been kind of a backup keeper in recent weeks and dealing with injuries. So Pantemis has been getting more run, and he's looked okay enough. But also Araujo, one of their center backs, has been dealing with green card issues, still hasn't dealt with that, but then also going on duty for Peru anyways. So he is completely out of contention in this one. And then also Lassiter, another option on that left wing, who's been getting some, playing time because Jonathan Rodriguez has been out, also gone for international break. So you're probably going to see a front line of one of Mora or Kelsey at the starting striker, with DaCosta at the 10, and then probably Anthony and then Moreno on the sides, which is still okay enough. But this midfield as well and this back line is one I've been just, kind of targeting and harping on how poor it's been, and how they didn't really fix anything from last season. And João Ortiz in that midfield to kind of rotate between him and Chara hasn't really been too much of a help. And on the road, especially, the Timbers just usually ship goals. I think under Neville, it just hasn't been a primary concern of his, and that play style really hasn't differed since he's been there. And so I think they're going to be exposed in this one. And the Rapids besides Stefan being out, are pretty healthy from an attacking perspective. All those guys are healthy. The only potential worry in this one for the Rapids as well is maybe Atencio and Ronan, both of their kind of defensive mids being out in this one, because they did both miss last game with different types of injuries. But at the same time, I don't think I think one of those guys will be back, and regardless, I think it might be a bit of a heavy transition game, and I still like the Rapids enough, so I'm still kind of getting a little bit of coverage there. I don't think this is going to be a 1-0 game if the Rapids win, and so while you could just take the money line, I think they'll probably need to. I think it's a bit of a safety net anyways. I just see this being maybe a little bit more of a higher scoring game, and the Timbers could certainly score one with their attacking potential. But I think with the altitude advantage that the Rapids obviously get, and I just think they're the far better lineup with the far better coach. And they've had a bit of a tough schedule to start with 3 straight away matches. But being back at home here, I think they'll be all over the Timbers, and they'll, score a couple goals at the same time, and that also gets us to the 2 goals. I think regardless, the Rapids get 2 to carry us through on this one, and even if the Timbers score, that should be enough to get the job done. Next up, it's RSL hosting Dallas. RSL got a big road win at Houston last time out. Meanwhile, Dallas lost to Vancouver, which made it 2 straight home losses. But in this one, I'm actually siding with Dallas for my 4th and final best bet of this show. I'm going with Dallas on the double chance, so Dallas to win or draw at -115. And the reasoning is a fairly simple. RSL is missing their best player. Straightforward and simple as that. Like, Diego Luna finally called up to USA national team camp, first time ever, the main U.S. team, which is fantastic news for USA, as a camp and him, because he absolutely deserves it. But he's absolutely been about 80% of what's been positive for this team so far to start the season. Especially last week, he completely carried them in that win against Houston with goal contributions in for both goals. And also Marchuk, one of their younger wingers, has been called up to international duty with one of the Polish youth teams. And even though I don't personally think he's been enough of a good, solid replacement for, the players they lost in the summer, he's still been basically one of their other main guys in terms of their goal contributions so far. They've only scored 5 goals, 4 actually, if you don't include that bizarre Nuhu own goal against Seattle. So of their 4 goals, this is basically all their goal contributions, or in some form, guys who have been involved in that, leaving. And besides that, you have a lot of youth on this team between the attacking, what's left of that attack, and the midfield. And against Dallas, who, despite being absolutely horrid on the road last season, has yet to lose on the road this season after winning in Houston as well in week 1, and then a great comeback against the Rapids on the road. And so despite their 2 most recent losses, they're far more healthy, and I think they have the far more solid lineup despite being in this altitude on the road at RSL. Their only key guy missing is one of the best goalkeepers, admittedly, in MLS, Martin Paish, because of his duty with Indonesia, I believe. But regardless of that, this attack has so much potential. It's just that they're not really... Their possession rate isn't really good enough to create too many opportunities sometimes. But in individual moments, they do have the stars to shine with Lucho Costa, Peter Musa, and even with Julio Santos not dealing with his own, I think, green card issues, you still have Pedrinho, Farrington. I think that's still a solid enough attacking lineup to get the job done in this one, because RSL really has struggled for goals. It's been the goals that have come, especially in that win against Seattle, I wasn't particularly impressed in that game. But that altitude can be a serious advantage, in certain situations. I just think Dallas specifically in this one will be able to handle it. I think they have the far superior lineup, and when you're taking out a team's best player on a team that is very, very young, and I'm just not especially high on anyways, I think this is a great price for Dallas to continue their unbeaten run, at least on the road. And RSL as well, even though both these teams are basically both middle of the pack in terms of the expected goals and the numbers in that side of the ball, so far this season. RSL is second worst from an expected goals allowed perspective so far, and they've really been, they haven't really been easy to trust defensively. They had a goalkeeping carousel last year as well. I think they've finally settled into a starting keeper, but I'm not sure he's, I don't think he's really the real deal anyways. And so while, yes, RSL always can make things, tough at home to pull out a result, I think getting this protection and at least getting a draw out of this is definitely possible for Dallas. So that's where I'm going with the final best bet. One of the final games on Saturday night features the Sounders hosting the Dynamo. Both these teams coming off of losses in Week 4, Sounders against St. Louis and the Dynamo against RSL at home. And this has been a hotly contested rivalry in a sense from last season because they met in the playoffs. Seattle won both games in that best-of-3 series on penalties. And just in general, when these two teams have met up recently, it's been very low eventful, very scrappy. Two, at least from last season, defensively organized teams. The Dynamo have kind of lost that touch in a sense this season because of the transfers they've made. But Seattle, their potential and prospects for this season in terms of how successful they can be have really been damaged, like I mentioned in the past week or two as well, because of these injuries recently, with Paul Arriola now out for the season. Jordan Moore is dealing with an injury. Vargas and Nuhu being called up now to international break. De La Vega also dealing with his own injury. Roldan as well. Like, that's more than a handful. That's even more than a handful of players who are definitely not playing in this one. You're going to get a lot of depth tested, probably like Jesus Ferreira maybe finally playing at the number 9, which I think everyone's been kind of, dying to see for this team. But the pieces around him might be lacking from a quality perspective, and I think it just lends itself to another ugly game against the Dynamo team that, once again, just fails to score goals, fails to create opportunities. Their one goal last week was on a set piece header to Ponce. The week before, a 0-0 draw against the Crew, and haven't scored more than one goal in a game so far. And going on their own to Seattle, who is definitely one of the best defensive teams in the league. Nothing jumps out at me. It's hard not to see this one being another very low scoring game. But the last time I said about Seattle in their game against LAFC, they absolutely lit it up. But a lot of the players in that game, won't be healthy for this one. And so I think maybe Seattle just does enough. But honestly, I'm going to say 0-0. To wrap up the weekend, it's only one game on Sunday this week due to Miami and the Revs not playing. And it's not even technically, I guess, Sunday night soccer since it is a little bit earlier in the afternoon. But it is still the only game on Sunday. And it's Austin taking on San Diego. And all 4 of Austin games have been 1-0 results. The trend continues for Austin. But last time out, they got a win against LAFC, got an early goal, and then just held their defensive lines, kept everything in front of them, and pulled out the result. And the big thing for Austin is just going to be getting that attack flowing, because both their goals in each goal and each win have been from set pieces. And so no open play goals still for an attack that consists of Brandon Vasquez, Mirto Uzuni, the other big signing, Bukhari, and the list goes on, is just, it's not good enough. And under Estevez, who we've seen in Dallas, not really get the best out of the attackers he had in Dallas that led him to being fired, to see this happening again, it's hard to really believe that he's going to fix things just because the quality of his attackers are better. That doesn't, mean that the patterns of play are going to be good enough to set those attackers up for opportunities. And so I don't know if the jury's still even out on Estevez, but he's been given the reins to this team as the new manager, and week by week, if the defense doesn't hold up, which clearly that's been the main priority since they've been the best team from limiting the XGA from other teams. But if that doesn't hold up, then his seat definitely gets hot. But in the meantime, it's still early days, and they host San Diego here, which still undefeated after coming back against the Crew, forcing the Crew to 10 men at home, but still 2 draws, no wins yet at home. But in both the road games, they've gotten wins so far. So it's fantastic for them. But both teams dealing with a couple players out for the international break. For Austin, it's another big hit for the chemistry in this front line because Uzuni's out on international break. And for San Diego, it's Patty McNair and Anibal Godoy, a key defender and a key midfielder for this team that is really, really low on depth because Andre Reyes, the other center back signing from the Red Bulls, who hasn't been fit so far, is not fit again for this one. And so it's going to be a bit of an interesting situation to see how they manage without these 2 key players in the spine of that team going on the road. But once again, San Diego, we know, loves to hold possession. They're one of the highest possession rates in the league. And regardless of those 2 injuries, they're going to kind of take the sting out of the game, and they're going to frustrate Austin. And Austin really hasn't proven to, be too dangerous when the defense on the flip side, they like to keep the other team's offense ahead of them, in front of them. But on the flip side, if San Diego is going to be holding a lot of possession and not really giving up too many transition opportunities, I just don't see this one playing out well for Austin, but I just don't see goals in this one once again because San Diego is going to be kind of a thorn in Austin's side. And, regardless of San Diego's lack of depth here, they probably have the better philosophy that tends itself to kind of allow some of its star players to maybe decide a game like this once again. But I still think this one ends in a draw. I think San Diego pulls out another 1-1 draw on the road. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Let me know what matchups you're looking forward to the most in Week 5 with all these teams ravaged by injuries. Who you think has the best potential to still survive this lineup madness? And if you're tallying any of the best bets, best of luck. And in the meantime, enjoy this weekend slate of matches. And I'll see you guys in the next video.